What does it take for a forgotten soul to become a city's savior? In the heart of Crest Haven, where skyscrapers cast long shadows over forgotten alleys, Jim Carter lived unnoticed. Once a decorated war hero, he was now just another shadow among the homeless, his medals tucked away in a tattered backpack, his past buried beneath years of hardship. But when disaster struck, Jim's courage would rewrite his story in the cities. Jim had served 2 tours overseas, leading his squad through chaos with a steady hand. He returned home to applause, but the cheers faded fast. Nightmares haunted him. Jobs slipped through his fingers. Friends drifted away. By 2023, he was sleeping on park benches, invisible to the bustling crowds of Crest Haven. The city had turned its back on him, just as he'd once shielded it from harm. That autumn, Crest Haven faced its darkest day. A gas leak sparked an explosion in the downtown subway, collapsing tunnels and trapping dozens beneath rubble. Panic gripped the city. Emergency services scrambled, but the scale of the disaster overwhelmed them. Streets filled with screams and smoke as hope dwindled. Jim was nearby, curled up in an alley with his thin blanket. The blast shook him awake. Instinct kicked, and not the instinct to flee, but to act. He'd heard those sounds before. The cries of the trapped, the crackle of fire. Without hesitation, he ran toward the subway entrance, ignoring the police cordons. "Stay back," an officer shouted, but Jim's eyes were fixed on the smoke billowing from below. He slipped past the chaos, his old military training guiding him. The tunnels were a maze of debris, but Jim moved with purpose. He found the first group of family of 4, pinned under a collapsed beam. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear. "I've got you," Jim said, his voice steady despite the trembling ground. Using a broken pipe as a lever, he freed them, guiding them to an exit before heading back in. Again and again, Jim returned to the darkness. He carried an elderly woman to safety, her frail hands clutching his jacket. He pulled a teenager from a pile of rubble, whispering encouragement as the boy sobbed. He navigated smoke-filled tunnels to find a trapped firefighter, dragging him to fresh air. Each rescue tested his strength, but Jim's resolve never wavered. He didn't see strangers, he saw lives he could save. Word spread. Bystanders whispered about the ragged man who kept emerging from the subway, carrying people to safety. Reporters arrived, capturing glimpses of him before he vanished back into the tunnels. By nightfall, Jim had saved 27 people. Exhausted, covered in soot, he collapsed on the sidewalk as paramedics took over. The crowd watched in awe, but Jim just stared at the ground, catching his breath. The city began to piece together his story. A journalist recognized the faded insignia on Jim's jacket and dug into his past. Soon, headlines screamed, "Homeless veteran saves dozens in subway disaster." Crest Haven's leaders, who had long ignored the homeless, faced a reckoning. They'd walked past Jim countless times, never knowing the hero in their midst. Guilt stirred the city's conscience. The mayor, pressured by public outcry, announced a ceremony to honor Jim. They offered him a place to live, a job, and a medal for bravery. At first, Jim refused. "I didn't do it for medals," he said, his voice rough but firm. "I did it because they needed help." But the people of Crest Haven insisted. They wanted to right their wrong. The ceremony was held in the city square, under a gray November sky. Thousands gathered, their applause echoing as Jim stepped forward. He looked uncomfortable in the new suit they'd given him, but his eyes softened when a little girl from the subway family ran up and hugged him. "Thank you," she whispered. Jim knelt, smiling for the first time in years. The mayor unveiled a plaque, James Carter Way, renaming the street where Jim had slept for years. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a promise. Crest Haven began funding shelters, mental health programs, and job training for veterans and the homeless. Jim's story had shaken them awake. He wasn't just a hero for one day. He'd changed the city's heart. Jim moved into a small apartment, his medals now displayed on a shelf. He took a job training young firefighters, passing on the skills that had saved lives. But he never forgot the streets. On weekends, he walked the alleys, handing out blankets and food to those still invisible. "No one gets left behind," he'd say, echoing the code he'd lived by in war and in peace. Crest Haven had ignored him once, but now his name was etched in its streets and its soul. Jim Carter, the homeless war hero, had saved not just dozens of lives, but a city's conscience. His story reminds us, heroism doesn't always wear a cape. Sometimes, it wears a tattered jacket, carrying the weight of a forgotten past and the hope of a better tomorrow.